What's happening, everyone? Welcome into a special edition of the Final Whistle Sports Podcast. You know who I am. I'm your host, Blaine Spencer, the host. But today, I've got a real opportunity and treat for you guys. I have one of the best to do it in the fighting business. I have Kevin Iole, the boxing and MMA columnist for Yahoo Sports. It's a real honor to have him on the show. Kevin, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. How are you?
I'm doing great, my man. It's a privilege to be on with you, and coming after that UFC 261, we got a lot to talk about. Thanks.
Oh, it's going to be loads of fun talking it up with you today. But I want to talk about yourself first before we jump into all of the fighting that's been taking place in the last couple of weeks. So, Kevin, what really led you into sports media? And I know you cover specifically boxing and mixed martial arts. Was that always your passion from the start? Can you just elaborate and tell us a little bit about your story into the boxing and MMA sports journalism world?
Yeah, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and I was a sports fan from the beginning. And I had loved all sports, including boxing back in the day. You know, my father boxed in the Army. He was a boxing fan, and he just got me into boxing from an early age. But that wasn't necessarily my goal when I went in. I wanted to be a sports writer for as long as I can remember, or an announcer. You know, I used to lay on the bed when I was a kid and announce imaginary baseball and football games, and usually make myself the star of the game, right? And I did that stuff. But so I always wanted to be in sports media in some way. But like when you get in, it's a lot different than what you think it's going to be. And so sort of how I ended up getting the opportunity to do fights is when I was in college, I got a full-time job at a daily newspaper in suburban Pittsburgh where I lived. And that paper, they let me do a lot of great stuff. I got to cover Steeler games. You know, Pitt football was number one in the country a lot at that time. I got to cover them. I covered indoor soccer, and I hate soccer, but I got to do that. So I got to do a lot of stuff. But there used to be monthly boxing shows at Howard Johnson's in Pittsburgh, low-level shows. But I love boxing so much, and I said, "Hey, could I cover it?" And so they laughed and they said, "Yeah, go ahead." So I used to cover those fights. Well, lo and behold, while I was still working there, we got a heavyweight championship fight. And my boss said to me, "Well, you know what? You've been the one covering boxing. You're the only reason we have any boxing coverage, so I'm going to let you cover the fight." So I went to that. It was Larry Holmes versus Ronaldo Snipes. That fight, I believe, was 1981. So that would have been the year I graduated college. And I got to do that. And so it's just sort of was the thing that I was always doing other things, but I kept doing boxing. And then eventually it became more and more a specialty. And then all of a sudden, that's what I became known for, just covering fights. And since I've been at Yahoo, I got to Yahoo in 2007, exclusively the fighting, which is really nice.
For you, how much of a difference was when you were covering those lower fights and then a heavyweight comes in for the championship in the 1980s? What was the difference for you? Like atmosphere, just like the whole aura around the stadium. How was that?
Well, I think you know how it is when, you want to do stories and you want to interview people that, other people care about, and they want to see the interview and they want to, and so I'm covering the fights, and I realized not too many people were interested in what I was writing. And it was just like they weren't reading the stories because they didn't know who the fighters were and they didn't know who I was, and any of that kind of stuff. Now all of a sudden the heavyweight championship comes in, and that was what, 40 years ago. So a lot of people were interested in in that fight. Boxing was really big back at that time, and so there's a lot of people. So of course it's like exciting for me because now I know, okay, I am covering the tippy top of this particular sport. It's kind of like the Super Bowl of boxing. And, so it was great. I mean, I got a chance to see some really, the funny thing about boxing is kind of like baseball. I think boxing and baseball were the two sports for a long time where you really had a lot of good writers involved. They were writer sports. Football, not quite as much, but boxing and baseball, historically over the years, if you look back at some of the great writers, they covered those two sports. And so I got a chance to meet a lot of really good writers and learn from them as I was kind of getting started, and that was invaluable to me.
And how is the boxing world for you since covering it in the 80s and the early 90s and now into the 2020s? How has the world of fighting evolved in your opinion, especially now with MMA being brought into the fold, but boxing as a whole as well.
Well, if we think of boxing, I mean, certainly boxing, I think each decade kind of lost in overall popularity, right? The people who like it probably really a lot, but there's not as many people who like it as used to like it. And I think part of that is the way it's been promoted, that you have the best fights aren't always made. And, there's so many, we hear the other side of the street, and that's always a problem because the public doesn't care about your business problems. They want to see what they want to see. And if they go to a restaurant and say, well, I can't serve you the best steak because this guy won't deliver to my restaurant, hey, that's your problem, right? Figure it out. And I think that, boxing's had years of neglect, and that's hurt. MMA has come around, and I think when Lorenzo Fertitta and Dana White teamed up in 2001, basically what they said was they were huge boxing fans, and they said, let's keep what we like about boxing and let's take out the things we think are wrong with boxing. And that was sort of how they modeled the UFC. And we see that that's been very successful. So, it's different now. And it's kind of funny for me to say, well, that I cover MMA more than I cover boxing, but I think that's probably true just on the relative merits of what our readers are interested in.
Do you think that the way boxing and the promotions and especially the money has been a lot of the problem with trying to set up with those major fights? Unlike in UFC, Dana White is really negotiable, and he's the only person that's really trying to bring in the two different parties while you have multiple entities in boxing. Do you think that could be also a key component of why boxing has kind of seen a decline and UFC's on the rise?
Well, here's what I think the biggest issue is there. In boxing, there's no barrier to entry. And so you can get anybody come in and they have one of the best fighters in the world. And they are a player in the sport, even though they have no background in the sport. They have never promoted before, but they have that one fighter who's now a top level competitor. And they have a lot of say over when he fights, who he fights, where he fights, all those kind of things. Where you go into the UFC and you look at it, and the UFC is perceived by most people as the number one organization by far. And so if you're in the UFC, you're considered, just by virtue of that, the best of the best. Now, already we have the best of the best in this organization. And then they fight, they pay attention to the rankings, and they make people fight their way up to the top. And it's not always, linear, but it's very close to that. And so, I think that's the difference, the way the promotions are structured. And the UFC was able to structure that way because it was a dead sport when Lorenzo and Dana bought it. Whereas boxing, now boxing was on a decline as they bought it, but it was still an established sport, and the titles are owned by other people other than the promoters. In this case, the UFC's case and Bellator's case and whatnot, in MMA, largely the promoters control their own titles. And since the UFC is considered the most significant promoter and the biggest promoter out there, their title carries the most weight with the fighters and with the fans.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense with how the difference is in trying to, especially in boxing, you're trying to unify belts at times, like the recent Lomachenko-Lopez fight is one of the big fights that have taken place recently. But for you, when you're writing a story, what kind of angle do you try to bring in to your readers?
Well, I the one thing I don't want to do, and I did this, no matter when I covered baseball, and I covered hockey, I always tried, what is the story behind the story? And if I can tell a human element, that's what, because after all, these are human beings playing games that we've all played. And I want to tell the story of those people. And, when you relate it to fighting, if you see two guys fighting on the corner, do you really care that much? But if you know a little bit about why they're fighting and what the argument's about and what's going on, then you become more interested. And so if you have interest in a particular fighter, you're going to want to read about that fighter. And so I try to show a little bit of the fighter side and, the struggle. Like I always love the struggle that the fighters face, and so what it's like, on their way up, maybe they overcame extreme poverty on their way up, or they had some serious injury that they had to overcome. or they lost a bunch of fights and they were told they weren't good enough and they didn't believe it. But tell their story, what makes them them. I love to do that. And I think people really like to know that. There's not a lot of people out there that want to know X's and O's and that want to know, how this one, on the really big fights, yes, then that becomes a different story. Everybody's interested in it and they want to know the matchup. But, for the most part, I think, if you can show who these athletes are as human beings and why they're relatable to you, I think, you'll get more people interested in your story, more people reading them, and then that becomes bigger fans of the sport. And it kind of then, it all follows along and it builds your audience.
And that audience grew for you when you, in 2007, when past winners gave you the Nat Fleischer Award. How humbling was that for you to be able to get that recognition that you were putting in the work and you were getting the recognition that you awfully deserved?
Well, thank you. I mean, the Fleischer Award was, as you mentioned, is an award for career excellence in boxing journalism, and it's voted on only by former winners. And so at the time I won, I looked at the people who were alive and who voted, and it was giants in the industry. And so obviously that, it was an extraordinary moment for me. These were people I looked up to, and I read their books and I read their newspapers and everything in their magazine articles, everything that they did, because I love journalism from a long age, and I love good writing from a young age. And so it was remarkable, for me to be able to win that award. And, it changed my life, because basically what happened is once I won that, I was part of a group, not that I necessarily would ever equate myself with any of them, of some of the greatest boxing writers who ever lived. And so people like yourself, see that, and they want to talk to me because I won that award that so many of these greats have won. I'm certainly not on the level of some of those people, but it was just it's incredible to have your name next to them. There's no doubt about it.
So before we transitioned into this past weekend and some of the fights that have transpired, I want to go in. I have a couple fan questions that some fans gave me, and they want to ask you. The first question was, what was the favorite interview that you have been able to conduct in your career?
Oh, wow. There have been so many interviews that I've done that I loved. I think the one I would say that pops to my mind right off the top of my head will be a YouTube interview I did with Mike Tyson last year. And it was really good because I interviewed him about his life and what he was doing now. But we ended up talking about a funny story that happened in 2003, I think it was. Mike had called me because I had written a story on him, and he called me to thank me for the story. But when I got the phone call, I thought it was somebody impersonating Tyson. So I hung up the phone and I said, yeah, thank you, Mike. Okay, bye, click. And I hang up. And then a couple of days later, I go to the gym to interview Mike. And then he says to me, you hung up the phone on me. And I was like, I thought that was the worst Tyson impersonation ever. That was really you. And then we talk on this interview. It's on YouTube. If you search my name and his name, you'll find it. We talked about that. And he said that the story where I hung up on him was the best story anybody had ever written about him. So I like that story because I showed another side of Mike and our relationship. And, we had been through a lot over the years. So that's one that really sticks out. I guess one other one that I liked is I wrote a story on a guy named Dewey Bozella, and he was he was convicted and in prison of a murder that it turned out he did not commit. And then he was a boxer just getting started when he went to prison, and he always wanted to fight. So Bernard Hopkins heard about his story and put Dewey on one of his undercards when he got released from prison. So then I did that, and that was an interview that I'll remember.
That's incredible. The Tyson impersonation is absolutely mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, and I hung up the phone on him, and then I see him in the locker room, and he's like, "What'd you hang up on me for?" And I'm like, "Oh no."
Did you ever think that he was going to get back into the ring like he has this year?
No, never. I mean, I knew he loved it and he missed it, and all those guys, they miss it so badly, but never did I think we would see that. I thought, Mike had, he kind of had mellowed and turned the page, and obviously we're seeing that he still has that fire in him.
And him and Holyfield are going to get back in the ring
Pretty soon. They are.
That's absolutely crazy. All right. So the next one, I know you've covered so many events, but they want to know what was the favorite event that you've been able to attend.
Yeah, I guess just from memories would be Tyson Holyfield too, because that was the bite fight, and we went crazy doing stories like the newspaper. We had 6 or 7 reporters covering that fight, but most of them just left. All hell broke loose, and they said we don't want to be part of this, and they left. And one of my colleagues at the newspaper I was working at, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and I we went through the casinos, and I was on the phone. So remember, this is in 1997, so cell phones were out then, and I had a cell phone, but like indoors they didn't work, especially in a place like a casino. And I'm at the MGM Grand, and so I'm using payphones to call in updates to the city desk to give information about what I'm finding. And so I had seen 2 very prominent NBA players turning over blackjack tables. Later, they were accused of stealing blackjack chips by the hotel, but I saw them turning over the tables, not stealing any money. So I'm calling that in, and I'm on the phone, and I'm looking, and there's a guy standing next to me. There's a bank of like 4 or 5 payphones, and maybe young people watching this podcast won't remember what a payphone was, but they used to have those. Put a dime in, not a quarter, a dime, and it would work. And I'm looking over, and this guy has got like a vest on, but no shirt, and a bunch of chains. And then he's got a pistol sticking out of his waistband. And I'm on the phone talking about, criminal activity. And I said to the person, it's a little bit before 2 a.m, and the paper's going to be done at 2. And I go, I need to call you back. And she's like, no, don't hang up. I said, I got to call you back. So I hang up and I walk to another bank of payphones. She starts to yell at me. And I said, I was standing next to a dude with a gun, and I'm talking about crimes in the casino. I said, don't worry about it. So to me, like that night, and then when we were finally done, my colleague and I, we go back to the ground floor of the MGM where the arena was, and we're saying, do we do everything we can do? And just then we see Kirk Kerkorian, who is the owner of the MGM Grand. He's one of the richest people in the world. And he comes down with a guy named, at the time was the president of the MGM, a guy named Dan Wade. So it's reconfigured a little bit now, but at the time there was a bathroom right there where we were standing. So Kirk Kerkorian standing there, and Dan Wade goes into the bathroom. They were actually leaving the hotel. And Dan goes in the bathroom, and I looked at Joe, and he looked at me, and we said, we got to interview Kirk Kerkorian. What do you think about Mike Tyson biting Holyfield? So we walk over, and I said, Mr. Kerkorian, and I stick my hand out, and we introduce ourselves. And next thing you know, Dan Wade comes flying out of the bathroom, and he grabs Kirk, and he goes, no interviews, and he shoves him back into the bathroom, and he's blocking the door. And so Kirk at that time was, in his 80s. He lived at, in the late 90s, I think it was. But he was in his late 80s, but he was married to a pro tennis player. His wife was like 20 something at the time. But Dan didn't want him doing any interviews and shoved. So even all the craziness that went on that entire night, then we cap it with Kirk Kerkorian and him getting shoved into a bathroom. So it was very funny. And there was a lot that went on in between that I don't have time to talk about, but it was crazy.
That's insane. Dan Wade made sure he was not giving you a quote at night at 2 a.m. Nothing good happens after 2 a.m., right?
No, definitely not from a casino executive standpoint.
For sure. All right, and then the last fan question we have. I know this is a little bit. This is like a 2-parter. They want to know your top pound for pound boxers or UFC fighters right now. If you want to do like a top 3 or a top 5.
Well, yeah, no, I can. Let me just pull my site up. We have that on. So if you go to Yahoo Sports on either the boxing page or the MMA page, at the very top is a thing that says pound for pound. So right now, my top 3 in MMA are John Jones, Kamaru Usman, and Dustin Poirier. And I'm thinking about dropping Jones, because he hasn't fought in a while. I mean, I think he's still the best in the world, but he hasn't fought in 15 months. So what do we do for inactivity? And in boxing, I have Canelo Alvarez #1, Terence Crawford #2, and Naoya Inoue #3. So
Okay.
Those are my top in the men's boxing and men's MMA.
And yeah, for Jones, just because he hasn't fought, do you think him getting in the ring is going to happen anytime soon? Especially, like, I know he's contemplated either moving up to heavyweight potentially, or potentially going to move down just to try and like spice up his competition.
Well, he's not going to move down. He weighs 250 pounds right now. So he's not going to be going down to 185. That's for sure. No way he would be able to do that. He was named Bones when he was weighing 205. So I don't think we're going to see him, he would be Sticks if he was at 185. So he's not going to be doing that. But, I hope we see him come back. I mean, John's such a great fighter, one of the greatest fighters, if not the greatest who ever lived. And, that's, the public always wants to see those kind of people, right? And so to my way of thinking, I hope he comes back. I think eventually the UFC and he will settle their differences and get a fight made. But, it's a shame we're not seeing him right now.
Yeah, and you said you had Poirier at 3 right now. Do you is that just, how do you think that combats with Khabib now retiring and then everything else, especially in that weight class?
Yeah, I had Khabib number 1, but you remove him when he retires. You're not an active fighter. You're not in the pound for pound list anymore. And so I removed him. I mean, you look at what Khabib did. And I mean, how many guys in my top 10 right now? Let me just go back to my MMA top 10. And if you look at, I think there's 3 or 4 guys in my top 10 that Khabib had beaten. So I have Poirier number 3. Khabib beat him. I have Justin Gaethje number 7. Khabib beat him, and I just recently took Conor out of my top 10. I put Francis Ngannou in place of Conor, but I had Conor in for the longest time, and Conor's right there. So I mean, to me, that is Khabib just beating the best of the best of the best. It just shows you what a great athlete he was.
No doubt. So speaking of championships, let's jump into UFC 261. It had 3 of them.
Yeah,
fans were back. Just like, what was for you? I know you weren't in attendance from what I was watching your IG live this past week, and you weren't in attendance. You said you weren't going to be attending. So for you, what was the overall display? I know there was a huge, especially right before the championship fights, the whole Chris Weidman injury that kind of took the air out of the entire building, and it was incredible that the championships fights were able to bring the air back. So just
yes, it did.
Kevin, can you just elaborate on your overall impression of 261?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was one of the best cards UFC's had in a long time. I mean, I thought it just, I think maybe going back to what UFC 248 or 249, the first one after the pandemic was just a crazy card with a lot of great fights. And this one was of that ilk, right? I mean, there was just so many good fights and crazy things that happened. The first fight of the night, I was thinking, hey, this could be the fight of the night, right? The 2 women came out and, I think Liang, the Chinese fighter, she kind of screwed herself because I think she was so amped up by the crowd and they were so into it and, so much that she didn't really fight her fight. And she just went crazy and tore at Carnelossi and, she ends up losing the fight. But I thought that really set a tone that the rest of the card followed. And without fail, I mean, it was great fight after great fight after great fight. These guys and girls were really going at it and just a phenomenal. So to me, that was it. And then, I think the other things that stand out on the 3 title fights, number 1, Kamaru Usman's just, his excellence. I mean, look at the run that he's on now, just this amazing run of, wins over elite fighters. And he knocks George Masvidal out at Masvidal's own game. I mean, just absolutely amazing. Valentina Shevchenko showing what she is, this phenomenal icon, who could be the best pound for pound woman in the world.
Get her with Nunes in the ring. Somebody, please.
They fought twice and Nunes won both. But, remember, Amanda's a lot bigger than Valentina, and both fights were so close, especially that second one. They could have, gone either way. Mm-hmm. So you got that, going. And then, for Rose to become the first woman to regain a UFC title, and the way she did it against somebody like Wiley, wow. So, I mean, they, you want your big fights to close the show strong, and boy, did it ever do that.
I mean, for me, I think Rose really stole the show. The way she really just, even like, you could just feel like the air stop after the kick lands, and then the absolute chaos that ensued after Whaley hit the deck. But like, especially she beat, I think a lot of them beat them at their own game. I think Shevchenko was the one who actually fought her game, her style. in the fight, but the other two kind of went pound for pound with Usman against Masvidal standing up, right? And as well as Namajunas, she tried to take it with Weili's pound for pound hitting style. So I think it was really intriguing to see how 2 out of the 3 fights kind of tried to they beat them at their opponent's own game.
Well, even Shevchenko did that because, Andrade said before the fight, I don't think Shevchenko has very good wrestling. So what did Shevchenko do? She went on and she wrestled and she was 7 for 7 in takedowns. And so it was, she certainly said, I'm going to show you. And I thought she was the most impressive of the champions doing that. Usman certainly, was, and Rose getting the knockout as early as she did. But you got to give it to Shevchenko. I mean, she just dominated, and she did it by wrestling, which Andrade thought was going to be her strong suit.
Would she be your top performer of the night, Shevchenko, then?
I think Shevchenko deserved that. It's hard to not give it to Usman because, he could be the pound for pound best male in the world. But I mean, look what we saw on that card. You had 5 champions on that card in the final 3 fights. Just an incredible night. You could really give it to any one of those. But I think, it was such a systematic beating by Valentina and so emphatic. And she showed how good she really is, and I think when you look at it from that standpoint, you got to say she was the fighter of the night.
I can't argue with it at all whatsoever. But before, I know it's hard to talk about Chris Weidman, the injury. It kind of just was horrible to watch, especially when he didn't realize until he planted to try and brace himself after coming back down. Very vivid pictures. If we totally disclosed, if you don't want to see the video, do not watch it. It's very, very tough to see. But Uriah Hall, he ended up winning it because of the injury, of course. And Weidman now has been, out of the 3 instances that a leg has snapped on a leg kick, he's been a part of 2 of them.
Yeah.
What is your overall concern for that? I know he posted a video today about already having a game plan to get him back into the training facility in about 6 months to get back to potentially getting back in the octagon. Just what do you see in his motivation to try and will himself back out there, like how Anderson Silva did when it happened against Weidman?
If I did not know better, I would swear Chris Weidman was not human. For him to do what he's, say what he's going to do and have the kind of attitude that he has, it's just remarkable. But, the thing that I think about what happened in this fight is a reminder to us as fans. Sometimes we want to complain about a fight being stopped too early and, whatever, and a guy tapping too soon. These people are risking their lives and they're basically for our entertainment. And you never have to forget that. And so I think when you saw what Chris Weidman went through, if you were watching that, it was a very graphic example of the risks, the very real risks these fighters are taking. I was ringside for 7 fighters who died, all in boxing. I had one of them actually fall on me, come through the ropes and fall on me at ringside. And that never leaves you. And so I always hope that fans who saw that particular incident with Weidman recognize what these fighters all are risking. And then if they see a fight stop too soon, you may feel like, oh, he could have gone on, but understand why the referees are doing that, because that to me, is something that the people who aren't in the business sometimes don't think of the human toll that these fights take. And there is a very real human toll that it takes. And Chris Weidman just reminded everybody on Saturday what that is.
Very unfortunate way to have people reflect about the entire sport as a whole, and then being able to cherish those moments that these guys are putting their lives on the line for us to enjoy how well that they're good at their sport that they're accustomed to do.
No doubt. I mean, and you gotta, I've seen fights where fighters have died, and it's like, do I ever want to see another fight again? But I realize, the fighters are dying doing what they love.
Yeah.
And they get injured doing what they love. And the incident is actually lower than people would think. So, I can, reckon with it, but it's tough, and just always have sympathy for them and their family. Imagine what Chris Weidman's wife is now going to go through, because he said today he's not going to be able to walk for, what was it, 8 weeks? I think he said.
Yeah, he said hopefully without crutches in 8 weeks. Yeah.
so his wife is going to have a lot on her hands dealing with a 230-pound husband that she's got to move around and help in that house. And, it's just one of those things that, that we watched the fight. We said, oh, I hope he's okay. And then we move on to the next one and we forget about, there's going to be a lot going on behind the scenes. And, that goes back to one of the earlier questions you asked me. That's what I like to write about, like these kind of things. Like what I remember, the third one, you didn't mention the third leg this snap was Corey Hill. And I actually wrote a story. I talked to Corey and not long after he broke his leg. And unfortunately, he subsequently passed away, not due to the leg injury, but he passed away. But, I remember talking about his rehab and what he was going through and mentally how hard it was on him. And it was just remarkable to hear him talk. And those are the kind of stories that I think that people really want to hear. What is Chris Weidman thinking now? What is Chris Weidman, and we have to respect his privacy. When he's ready to talk to the media, he'll talk. But what motivates him to want to continue on after having this happen? Every one of the fighters that had this happen, Anderson Silva, Chris Weidman, and Corey Hill, they all said they wanted to come back and fight again. 2 of the 3 made it back. And so, we'll see, we'll see if Chris makes it back, but, it's a sobering reminder of the brutality of combat sports.
Mm-hmm. And let's transition. Before we transition to boxing and talking about Jake Paul, the Trilogy fight. You said you have McGregor, you just took him out of your top 10, and Poirier is now at your third on your rankings list. What is you're accustomed to see, what you want to see out of that Trilogy fight? I know it's still ways away in comparison, but still, that's one of the next big fights up and coming. What do you want to see out of that?
Well, I want to see a decisive winner. I want to see no controversy, no argument that it was too quick a stoppage or, a bad decision. I want it to be a clean, because that person is probably going to be the next challenger for the title, right? So the winner of that fight. So I think that we want to see that person get a clean, clear, convincing victory. I think in both of the first 2 fights, we saw that, there was no argument about Conor's knockout of Dustin, no argument about Dustin's knockout of Conor. So now we come back, this third one, let's have it one more time. Who is the better man? Who wins that trilogy and who gets the title shot? That's really what I want to see. I mean, I think that their styles are such that we can't help but have a great fight, right? I mean, they're offensive style fighters. They have a lot of different tools. So I think we can't help but have a great fight. So we just want to see a clear winner and no controversy, so that when we go to the championship and whoever wins at UFC 262 coming up, Chandler or Oliveira, that we have clear-cut, fighters that there's nothing on their resume that's now questionable that makes people say they don't deserve to be where they are.
Agreed. I completely agree. I definitely want to see, especially after Conor's reacted, because he's kind of been slow since coming back in the last couple of years, trying to bounce back. This time he's going to have a full training camp really before and after the Poirier loss and defeat. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. So Kevin, before I let you go, I want to transition to boxing real quick with the whole Triller situation and Jake Paul. He's 3-0. I just want to see, what's your overall credibility towards Paul and these victories? He's beaten Nate Robinson, former basketball player, as well as Ben Askren, former MMA specialist. So for you, what's the credibility like, and what do you want to see next out of him?
Well, I think he still has something to prove to boxing fans, right? I don't think he's proven that he's a great boxer yet. But, I give him credit, I mean, hey, look, if you watched the UFC show the other day, you heard what I heard, the fans chanting F Jake Paul. So obviously he's made a name for himself, right? He's built, Daniel Cormier got up out of his seat from broadcasting and went over and confronted him. So Jake Paul is making a lot of money, and he's making a lot of people take notice of him, which is a good thing in combat sports. Now, I am not big on, what I would call gimmick fights, and, that's a gimmick fight, and Ray Khan versus Joe Fournier was a gimmick fight. And I even think these, Tyson, Holyfield, those are all gimmick fights. I've expressed to the Ryan Kavanaugh of Triller my belief that they got a lot of good things going on. I love the way they're doing the music and trying to, blend the two worlds together, but do it with real fights. And I think that, they're trying to transition to that. And their Teofimo Lopez card will be what Ryan Kavanaugh tells me as of now. They took the Holyfield Kevin McBride fight off that undercard. And so that's going to be all boxing, legit. What he says is going to be legit boxing. I don't want to say it is legit boxing because I haven't seen the matches yet, but that he says will be legit boxing matches.
That's good, people.
I think that's where they need to go. And as far as what Jake is, I've talked to a number of people who have been at Mayweather Boxing Club when he's training and say the guy can fight. I haven't seen it in a fight yet. He hasn't been in the ring all that long. So I want to see that, but I think, hey, maybe he has potential to be good. We're going to have to see him facing better competition. I think he's got a few more of these, gimmick fights, for the lack of a better term, lined up, and we're going to see him do that. And then eventually, maybe he'll get into fighting real boxers. But I hope he turns out to be good because you know what? He's got a fan base already, and he's got people that want to watch him. And if he's good and actually can fight, that's only going to be good for boxing.
Yeah, and my overall critique of Jake Paul has been just show me yourself against a boxer because I need to see it because right. I've never seen a man so happy that he got knocked out. I think you've seen the video with him walking out with his wife. I've never seen a man so happy just to come in and take a paycheck and walk out because it didn't really feel like he was really out there from the get-go to really. I think he started a little bit out fast, and I think he came to saying, "What's the best way for me to take this check and walk out here and walk out okay?" I don't know.
I thought Askren would fight better than he fought. Right? I actually thought he would win, and not because I thought he was a great striker, because I knew he wasn't a good striker, but I thought he would win because of this. He's been in fights before. He knows how to control his emotions in a fight. And I didn't know if Jake Paul knew that, right? Jake Paul fought guys that he pretty much knew he was going to be able to beat. Now he's fighting a guy that knew how to fight and was going to be calm and was going to be ready. But it looked like Ben didn't train. I talked to Freddie Roach after the fight, and Freddie had told me when I interviewed him, and I was a little annoyed at Freddie because he told me, Ben was in great shape on day one. And I go like, Freddie, did you see him?
Yeah,
and Freddie said, he was with me for his first week of training camp, and then I didn't see him again. He goes, the guy that I saw in the ring was not the guy that was in my gym working out every day. So, Ben looked like he didn't train to me. That's, I don't know how else to say it. But if he wasn't in shape, the way I thought he was going to win the fight, kind of make it ugly, hold, for entire Paul out for a few rounds. And then when he was tired out, maybe start hitting him with punches and stop him. You had to be in cardio shape to do that. And if there was anything you would have said to me that Ben Askren could do in the fight, well, I would say it would be have cardio. And then when he blew that, he really had no chance.
Absolutely. And now, Kevin, before I let you go, this is my final question for you tonight. What is the fight, if you had any choice, if it was in the boxing world or in the UFC world, what's the fight you want to see happen right now?
Well, I hope it's okay to give one of each because there's two fights that I really
by all means.
I have. So I'm going to say on the boxing side, Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua. And on the MMA side, Francis Ngannou and John Jones. I think we got to see that happen. To me, that would be the ultimate, I think John would win that fight if he fights Francis. I think John's game is so good and so well-rounded. He'd find a way to beat Francis. But I want to see him do it. And I think that would be an affirmation of his greatness as a fighter. So those would be the two I like.
All right. What are your thoughts on Errol Spence versus Terence Crawford potentially?
That's a fight that I have called for many times. I love that fight. The two best welterweights in the world, and it is absolutely ridiculous that we're not seeing that. So I think I think that's a fight that should be made, and I would hope gets made at some point this year. But the way businesses run, going back to what we talked about before, I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for it.
Darn. We can only hope. Well, Kevin, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your evening to come onto the Final Whistle Sports podcast and talk it up with me. Is there anything that you want to say to my fans to check you out, stuff like that?
Well, I appreciate you, Blaine, for having me. And if anybody wants to follow me on social media, on Twitter, I am at Kevin I, Kevini. And on Instagram, I'm Kevin Iole, Keviniole. Just a warning, if you follow me on Instagram, you'll get a lot of fight pictures, but you also get a lot of pictures of my Basset Hound and in my golf game. So just be prepared for that.
His swing looked okay this past weekend. I can validate. I watched the video. Well, everyone, Kevin, I hope we can do this again soon. It was a real pleasure to have you on. Thank you again.
You got it, brother. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right, everybody. That was your special edition of the Final Whistle Sports Podcast. Go tune in. And I've got some major announcements coming out in the middle of this week. Be on the lookout. Have a good one.